Welcome to episode 2, everyone. In the last session, we tried to broadly frame some of the possible meanings of post-truth. Among these is the alleged decline in the public's respect for expert advice, which is often more broadly construed as a loss of authority of science. Various examples are supposed to illustrate this. The increasing visibility of anti-vaccine activists, the rejection of anthropogenic climate change, and more recently, the spread of fringe theories about the dangers of 5G wireless bandwidths, even imagined to be linked to COVID-19. Many explanations have been offered which try to account for this apparent downgrade in the standing of science. Here we are interested in one that has frequently appeared in the discussions surrounding post-truth: the role of academia itself. According to these accounts, post-truth has not been ushered in by an ignorant public mob, but it has been an inside job. Intellectuals working within the institutions of knowledge production have been actively undermining them. This subversive movement has often been broadly labeled postmodernism. There's a lot to be said about the term postmodernism and its supposed relationship with post-truth. Too much then can be said here. The term itself has been used in many ways, from describing aesthetic changes in various forms of art and design, to pointing to widespread socioeconomic changes in the decades following World War II, to diagnosing the attending shifts in worldviews, and probably the sense which has the most familiar connotation, to denote a set of intellectual and philosophical outlooks. This last sense is much more commonly wielded by detractors of the views that supposedly characterize postmodernism than by anyone who openly declares themselves a postmodernist, if such people even exist. And one of the views that is taken to be the hallmark of postmodernism is relativism. Relativism is also an impossible term to sum up neatly, but in its epistemic sense, it is connected to a skepticism about truth. As Blackburn says, the very notion of truth. A concern with relativism is present in the discussions making up this session's readings. To frame this concern plainly, work in STS has been shaped by various commitments to relativism, or more simply, skepticism about certain notions of truth, namely scientific kinds. Has such skepticism precipitated our post-truth environment? Is STS part of the subversive postmodernism that has allegedly corrupted the academy and weakened its capacity to present itself as a bastion of knowledge? Have we been implicated? To consider these charges, we should look at the ways in which relativism appears in STS. Collins is as good a place to start as any, not least because he is a scholar who explicitly used the term relativism in defining his early STS approaches in the sociology of scientific knowledge, or SSK for those of you trying to keep track of all the acronyms in STS. One of his first programmatic statements was the Empirical Program of Relativism, or EPOR, since we're on the topic of acronyms. This program advocated a sociological approach that looked at the stabilization of scientific theories, whereby the truth claims of the scientist under study could not become part of the sociological explanation. This reflects the symmetry and impartiality principles of David Bloor's Strong program. If you are analyzing a scientific controversy, you do so symmetrically, assuming neither side's knowledge claim is true. That is, actually true. And instead, you look for the social factors involved in the closure of that controversy. You were impartial to the claims of truth and falsity on behalf of the actors under study. You treat them as equivalent. Hence, it is a relativistic approach. But as Lynch points out in his contribution to the discussion, this approach was methodologically relativistic, not epistemically or normatively so. This is to say, these analyses did not argue that any particular scientific knowledge claim, taken outside of the context of an SSK case study, should be treated as relative. Impartiality was not some thoroughgoing philosophical position whereby STS scholars walked around in their lives doubting the claims of scientists. Various STS scholars explicitly went out of their way to state that such sociological work should have no normative bearing on the way that scientists actually go about doing their scientific work. So if SSK was so inconsequential, what was the point? Collins and others argued that a relativistic approach was necessary to correct a long-standing fallacy in accounts, especially historical accounts, of how scientific knowledge developed. These accounts took for granted that some scientific truth emerged in virtue of it being true. Aside from this being circular, it led to the assumption of problematic kinds of historical explanations, namely that certain historical developments were inevitable. Assuming inevitability based on the way things happen to turn out is the epitome of question begging, as David Hume pointed out long ago. Looking at science as an historical phenomena, or more specifically, the historiography of science, revealed just how empty such explanations were. At any point in this historiography, you could find an historical account in a teleological vein. Newtonian mechanics became scientific truth because it was obviously true, until it wasn't anymore. A narrative of truth emerging inevitably from the application of scientific rationality could not hold, because what was once held to be inevitably true was no longer so. How could one now retrospectively account for the fact that for over 200 years, Newton's laws of motion were held up as the hallmark of science's ability to yield timeless, universal truths? That generations of scientists were simply wrong? The standard asymmetrical account of false beliefs is that people are affected by bias, ideology, or incompetence. In other words, they are irrational. But how could irrationality possibly explain the widespread acceptance of Newtonian physics? The emergence of a scientific truth needed a more complex explanation. Truth held because of specific social and historical conditions, not in virtue of somehow transcending these conditions. In order to understand the role of these social and historical factors, early STS scholars argued that one would need to treat categories of rationality and irrationality, truth and falsity, impartially from the analyst's perspective. Rationality and truth could no longer serve as explanations for why some theory became accepted. Instead, rationality and truth were to be treated as categories in need of social and historical explanation themselves. This would involve, among other things, looking at the actual criteria, standards, objectives, and values shaping claims of scientific knowledge. And the establishment, acceptance, and maintenance of this knowledge had to be understood in historical and sociological terms.